Isarava, Kokoda Track, Papua New Guinea, August 26, 1942, U2.17. The world was water. It dripped from the canopy 150 feet above, ran in cold rivulets down his neck, and pooled in the sucking black mud at the bottom of his trench. Private Jack O'Reilly, 39th Militia Battalion, didn't shiver. Shivering made noise. He hadn't moved a muscle in 2 hours, and every part of him was a dull, throbbing ache. He was 19 years old, but he felt ancient. The jungle wasn't quiet. It was a suffocating concert of insectile clicks, the squelch of a rat, and the constant maddening drip, drip, drip of the rain. But beneath that, there was another sound, a sound that didn't belong. Swish, pause, swish. It was the sound of wet fabric brushing against a leaf. Jacko's eyes, already straining in the pitch black, widened. He nudged the man next to him, Private Evans, with his elbow. Evans was asleep, his head slumped against the muddy wall of the foxhole, chin on his chest. "Evo," Jacko whispered, the sound barely a puff of air. "Wake up! Wake up!" Swish. Thud. The second sound was soft, heavy, like a bag of grain being dropped. It came from the pit 10 yards to their left, where Corporal Davies and his Bren gun team were supposed to be. Jacko's blood turned to ice. He fumbled for the cold steel of his own Lee Enfield rifle. His heart was a trapped bird against his ribs. A shadow detached itself from the other shadows directly in front of them. It wasn't a man. It was a shape, a void in the dark, low to the ground. It rose up over the lip of Davies's gun pit. There was a faint, wet shink of steel, followed by a terrible gurgling sigh that was cut off almost instantly. "Lights!" a voice screamed from the platoon command post 50 yards back. A flare cracked, hissing into the sky, and for 3 horrific seconds the jungle was illuminated in a sickly magnesium-white glare. It wasn't one shadow, it was dozens. They were inside the perimeter. Not charging, not yelling. Just there. They were small, wiry men, their faces painted green and black, clad in uniforms that were the exact color of the mud. They looked like creatures born of the rot itself. One of them was on the lip of Jacko's own foxhole. Evans, jolted awake by the flare, looked up. He didn't even have time to raise his rifle. The Japanese soldier, his eyes wide and bright, lunged down. He didn't use a rifle. He used a blade. Jacko reacted purely on instinct. He didn't shoot. He swung his Enfield like a cricket bat. The heavy wooden stock connected with the attacker's head with a sickening crack. The man folded and fell into the trench on top of Evans. The flare died, plunging the world back into a blackness more profound than before. The screaming started. Gunfire erupted from everywhere, a chaotic, panicked racket. Australians were firing at shadows, at the trees, at each other. The Japanese were clinically silent, save for the muffled sounds of their work. Jacko could hear them. They were in the trenches. A man cried out, "No, please, God, no," and was silenced. Jacko scrambled over the bodies in his pit, his boots slipping in the mud and something thicker. He clawed his way out of the trench and rolled into the ferns, his lungs burning. He lay flat, pressing himself into the earth, shaking uncontrollably. The main Japanese force opened up from the ridge opposite, heavy machine guns and mortars joining the fray. They knew exactly where the Australian positions were. The noise was a physical weight, a deafening, tearing sound that shook the trees and sent showers of leaves and branches down. The attack lasted 20 minutes. When it faded, the silence that returned was worse. The jungle's natural sounds were gone, replaced by the low moans of wounded men and the steady, relentless drip of the rain. Jack O'Reilly lay in the mud until the false dawn, clutching his rifle, listening to the sounds of his friends dying. He had survived, but he knew, with chilling certainty, that their position was useless. The enemy hadn't just attacked them. They had walked right through them. Chapter 2. The Unwinnable War. Port Moresby, Allied Headquarters, August 27, 1942-09. They are not, I repeat, not equipped for this. General Basil Morris, commander of the Australian forces in New Guinea, slammed his hand on the map. The map was a sodden, wrinkled mess, much like the men it represented. They are militia, gentlemen, children. We sent the 39th up that track with the expectation they would be a simple delaying force. An American liaison officer, crisp and clean in his khaki, shifted uncomfortably. General, our intelligence suggests the Japanese Nankai Shitai is a first-rate unit, veterans of Malaya and Borneo. They're veterans, all right? Morris countered, his voice raw with frustration. And our boys? They're chacos. The chocolate soldiers. That's what the AIF calls them. They're shopkeepers and farmers from Melbourne, sent up here in jungle greens that are so dark they stand out against the light green of the bush like crows on a fence line. The central problem was laid bare on the map. The Kokoda track. It wasn't a road. It wasn't even a track. It was a 96-kilometer-long scar of mud, a near-vertical nightmare of razorback ridges and vine-choked ravines that snaked over the Owen Stanley mountain range. It was the only land route from the Japanese beachheads at Buna and Gona to the critical Allied base at Port Moresby. If Moresby fell, Australia was next. Our doctrine is useless here, a young major from the 214th Battalion added, his face gaunt from his first trip up the line. Standard British infantry tactics. Dig in, establish clear fields of fire, repel frontal assault. It's a joke. He was right. The jungle, the kunai grass, and the fog reduced visibility to 10, sometimes 5 yards. There were no clear fields of fire. A machine gun could cover a small bend in the path, and that was it. The enemy, the Japanese South Seas Detachment, treated the jungle as their element. They didn't use the track, they used the jungle on either side of it. They were masters of infiltration. They moved with a terrifying silence, climbing trees like apes, sliding through the undergrowth and materializing behind the Australian lines. They didn't engage in long firefights. They infiltrated, cut supply lines, and annihilated isolated posts with bayonet and grenade in the dead of night. They're fighting a three-dimensional war, the major continued, and we're still fighting on a two-dimensional map. They're above us, they're beside us, and more often than not, they're behind us before we even know they're there. The terrain is the enemy, and they've made it their ally. We haven't. The stakes were absolute. The Australian Imperial Force, the veteran units from North Africa, were racing to reinforce the 39th, but they were weeks away from making a real impact. Until then, the Chocos, sick with malaria, ravaged by dysentery, and haunted by an invisible enemy, were all that stood between 10,000 elite Japanese soldiers and the Australian homeland. And they were failing. Chapter 3: Routine Failure and Rising Desperation. The Kokoda Track, near Deniki, August 28, 1942, 14:30. Right, B Company, you're the sharp end. Move up to the Yora Creek crossing and dig in. Hold 'em. Sergeant Frank Miller, Jacko's section leader, spat a stream of yellow-brown fluid. It was tobacco juice mixed with the Adabrin tablet he was chewing for his malaria. The taste was worse than the sickness. "Sir," Miller said, turning to the young lieutenant, fresh off the boat. "They won't come from the front. The crossing's a bottleneck. They'll go round." "They always go round," a private named Harris chimed in, his voice cracking on the verge of hysteria. "We dig in, they go round. We wait, they sneak in and cut our throats while we sleep." "Shut your hole, Harris," Miller barked. "You'll dig where I tell you. Standard procedure, interlocking pits, clear your lanes. You know the drill." They knew the drill, and they knew it didn't work. For 2 hours they dug into the clay-like slope. It was like digging wet concrete. The rain started again, and the pits immediately filled with a foot of water. The men were exhausted before they'd even finished. Their uniforms were caked in mud, their hands were blistered and raw. The air was a humid blanket, thick with the stench of mud and human sweat and the sickly sweet smell of decay that clung to everything. Jack O'Reilly dug his hole with a grim, mechanical rhythm. Dig, lift, dump, dig, lift, dump. He dug a standard rectangular slit trench, just like the manual said. It faced the track. It was a coffin. Contact, front. The cry came from the forward scout. A burst of gunfire, high and fast, the woodpecker sound of a Japanese Type 99 machine gun, tore through the canopy. "Stand to!" Miller yelled, diving into his own pit. Jacko dropped his shovel and grabbed his Enfield, his heart hammering. He peered over the muddy lip of his trench. He saw nothing, just a wall of green. Thwack, thwack, thwack. Bullets slapped into the mud wall just inches from his face, but they weren't coming from the front. They were coming from the left, from the jungle, where no one was supposed to be. "Where are they?" Harris screamed, firing his rifle blindly into the trees. "Where are they?" "Hold your fire. Wait for a target," Miller ordered. But there were no targets, only the thwack of bullets and the whump of knee mortars, the Japanese Type 89 grenade discharger landing with deadly accuracy. The Japanese gunners were invisible, firing on the sounds of the Australians digging. A mortar round landed with a wet thump directly in the trench Harris was in. The explosion was muted by the mud, a dull crump, but its effect was absolute. When the smoke and earth cleared, the trench was just gone. And so was Harris. "They're on the flank! They're on the flank!" Another burst of machine gun fire, this time from the right. And the front. They were surrounded. The patrol was caught in a classic Japanese U-shaped ambush. They hadn't even seen a single enemy soldier. "Bug out!" Miller screamed. "Fall back! Fall back to the ridge!" It wasn't a retreat. It was a rout. Jacko grabbed his rifle and ran, scrambling up the slick mud slope, vines tearing at his clothes. He didn't look back. He heard men screaming as they were hit. He just ran, his lungs on fire, the sound of the Japanese guns chasing him. They regrouped half a mile back on a ridge that was barely defensible. They had lost 6 men. 6 men, and they hadn't inflicted a single casualty. Miller collapsed against a tree, gasping. He looked at the survivors. Their faces were gray with fear and exhaustion. This ain't workin'," he panted, stating the obvious. "We're digging our own graves out there, every time. We're fighting like we're in bloody France, and they're fighting like they're panthers." Jacko Riley sat apart, cleaning the mud from his rifle bolt with a trembling hand. He wasn't a strategist. He was a sheep shearer from Victoria. But he knew one thing. The sergeant was right. This wasn't working. And if they didn't change, they were all dead. Chapter 4. The Unlikely Mind. Jacko Riley was not a complicated man. He was quiet, wiry, and had hands that were tough as old leather from years of working the shears and fencing the vast open paddocks of the high country. He wasn't a natural soldier. He hated the noise, the orders, the sheer waste of it all. But he was a worker. He understood tools, angles, and the land. Back home, when a mob of sheep would stampede, you didn't stand in front of them. You didn't build a brick wall. You'd be trampled. You built a race, a narrow channel of fencing, often angled, that used the sheep's own momentum to funnel them exactly where you wanted them to go. You used their instinct against them. As he sat there, cleaning his rifle, he watched the water from the endless rain. He watched a small stream as it hit a large, round boulder. The water didn't stop. It simply split, flowed around the boulder, and rejoined on the other side, eroding the banks as it went. "They always go round," Sergeant Miller had said. He thought of the ambush. The Japanese hadn't charged their pits. They had flowed around them, like water, and then hit them from the flanks and rear. The standard slit trench was a boulder. Useless. He thought about his job back home. Fencing. You didn't just string wire, you had to anchor it. The most important part of any fence line was the strainer post assembly at the corner. It was an L shape. The fence pulled one way, and a perpendicular stay post, dug deep into the ground, braced it against the tension. It was all about angles. They hit us from the flank. The idea sparked. It wasn't a flash of genius. It was a slow, practical connection of 2 problems. Problem 1, The Japanese always attack the flank. Problem 2, the standard trench only faces forward. So, what if the trench faced the flank? No, that was stupid. They just hit the new flank. He picked up a stick and began to draw in the mud. He drew the standard rectangle. He drew the path of the Japanese flowing around it. Then he drew an L. He imagined a soldier in that pit. The long arm of the L would face the track, the obvious front. It would be the decoy. He'd pile up logs and dirt there, make it look like a machine gun nest. But the real pit, the firing bay with the Bren gun, would be the short arm of the L. It would be dug parallel to the track at a right angle to the main assault. The Japanese would see the front and charge it. And as they ran past, they would expose their entire unprotected flank to the real firing bay. It was a funnel. It was a sheep race. He added more. The jungle didn't offer clear fields of fire? Fine. He wouldn't try to clear them. He'd create them. He'd leave the ferns and vines in place for camouflage, but he'd use his bayonet to trim tiny, invisible tunnels through the undergrowth at ground level, just wide enough for the barrel of a Bren. And the mortars, the tree bursts from grenades that sent shrapnel raining down, he'd put a roof on it, not a heavy one, just logs, covered with layers of dirt and leaves, strong enough to deflect a grenade or a mortar fragment, and angled to blend in with the slope. It wasn't a trench. It was a trap. It was a trapper's blind, built for men. He looked at his drawing in the mud. It was ugly. It was half rabbit warren, half fence post. It was nothing like the manual. But he thought of Evans. He thought of the gurgling sound in the dark. He picked up his shovel. He would dig. Chapter 5. Skepticism and First Steps. York Creek, the track, August 29th, 1942, 11. Riley, what in the seven shades of hell do you think you're doing? Sergeant Miller stood over him, hands on hips, his face a mask of disbelief. The rest of the section had dug their standard pits and were now trying to sleep, huddled under their leaking gas capes. Jacko was 3 feet deep in the mud, carving out his L shape. He was soaked in sweat and rain, his shovel making obscene sucking sounds as he worked. "Diggin', Sarge," Jacko said, not looking up. "That's not a trench, Riley, that's a bloody maze. The manual says a 3x5 slit trench 2 feet wide with a fire step. That thing's got a corner in it." Jacko stopped digging. He wiped his muddy forearm across his brow. He was terrible at explaining things. "They'll come down the track, Sarge, or from the flank, same as always." "Right. And you'll be facing the wrong way." "No, Sarge," Jacko pointed with his shovel. "They'll see this part." He indicated the pile of logs and fresh dirt he'd piled up on the long arm of the L. "They'll think that's the gun. They'll charge it, but I won't be there." He pointed to the short arm, which was dug perpendicular to the track, its firing port hidden by a curtain of vines. "I'll be here. I'll have 'em side on, a whole line of 'em, like shearing a new mob." Miller stared at the hole, then at Jacko. He was an old-school NCO. He'd fought in North Africa. He believed in doctrine, discipline, and clear fields of fire. This was none of those. "It's a two-man pit, Riley. Where's your partner? Who covers your back?" "It's not a two-man pit, Sarge. It's a one-man trap. It's built to be hidden. A two-man pit is twice the target. And what about mortars?" Miller kicked at the small pile of logs Jacko had assembled for the roof. "This'll just cave in and bury you alive. It's just to stop the tree bursts, Sarge, the shrapnel from grenades. It's better than an open top. An open trench is just a bucket for him to drop things in." Miller was silent for a long time. He looked at Jacko's design, then back up the track where he knew the enemy was massing. He looked at his exhausted, terrified men. What they were doing wasn't working. They'd lost half the platoon in 3 days. He chewed on his lip. "It's non-regulation. The major sees it, I'll be on a charge, and so will you." "Respectfully, Sarge, the Japs ain't read the regulations." A tiny, grim smile touched Miller's lips. "Bloody oath, they haven't." He kicked a loose log toward the pit. "This roof. Make it thicker. and use that bamboo over there to brace it. It's light, but it's strong." He turned to go. "But Riley." "Sarge, you're on your own. If that thing fails, I can't send men in to get you out. It's your funeral." "Understood, Sarge," Jacko said, and picked up his shovel. Chapter 6. Building the Prototype. The digging was the worst part. The earth on the Kokoda track wasn't soil. It was a heavy, primordial clay, interwoven with a dense mat of roots that had to be hacked apart with a bayonet or a shovel. Every shovelful felt like it weighed 50 pounds. Jacko worked with a shearer's obsessive focus. He didn't just dig, he sculpted. The false front. He built up the long arm of the L, to be obvious. He piled logs, caked them in fresh, dark mud so they'd stand out. He even put a broken branch on top to mimic a rifle barrel. It was an invitation, a target, the killing bay. The short arm was a masterpiece of concealment. He dug it deep, then undercut the bank, so the firing port was almost at ground level. From the outside it was invisible, hidden behind a clump of ferns he'd carefully left in place. He carved 3 separate ports, one facing the track, one facing down the track, his enfilade position, and one facing into the jungle, just in case. He could seal each one with a plug of mud and leaves. The tunnels. He crawled out on his belly, snake-like, and used his bayonet to trim the undergrowth. Not cut it down, trim it. He created 3 lanes, no wider than his hand, radiating from his firing ports. They were invisible to anyone standing up, but from his low-angle pit, they were clear, perfect lines of sight. The roof. He cut lengths of bamboo, as Miller had suggested, and laid them across the top of the bay. On top of that, he put a layer of woven vines, then a thick layer of packed earth. Finally, he replanted the ferns and moss he had carefully removed, dressing the position until it was just another lump in the jungle floor. The interior. He dug a grenade sump in the floor, a small, deep hole. If a grenade landed in the pit, he had 1 second to kick it into the sump where the blast would be channeled downward. He carved shelves into the mud walls for his spare Bren magazines and grenades, so he could grab them in the dark without looking. He finished after 4 hours. He was caked in mud from head to toe, his hands were bleeding, and he was shaking from the exertion. He crawled inside. It was damp, cramped, and smelled of wet earth and roots. It was a tomb. But it was his tomb. He slid the Bren gun into the main firing port. He peered through the tiny tunnel he'd cut. He could see a 30-yard stretch of the track perfectly from the side. Private Bluey Jones crawled over, his face pale. "Crikey, Jacko, you burying yourself? Looks like a bloody wombat hole." "Just trying something different, Blue." "Well, you're mad," Bluey said, shaking his head. "Mad as a cut snake." He crawled back to his own shallow, water-filled slit trench 20 yards away. Jacko just checked his ammunition. He laid out 3 grenades, pins up, and he waited. Chapter 7. The First Test. Eora Creek, August 29, 1942, 23:40. The night was absolute. The moon was strangled by the canopy and the clouds. The air was heavy, wet, and alive with the zzz of insects. Jacko was in the killing bay. He was alone, and the claustrophobia was a physical weight. The smell of the damp earth was overwhelming. He could hear the drip of water from his roof. He'd been staring into the blackness for hours, his eyes aching. Then the insects stopped. The silence that fell was louder than any explosion. It was the classic sign. Jacko eased the Bren gun forward, his knuckles brushing the wet leaves of his camouflage. He put his eye to the firing port. He saw nothing. Click. The sound was tiny. A pebble being kicked. It came from 40 yards up the track. Swish. Swish. They were coming. Not a full assault. A probe. Infiltrators. They were looking for the forward pits, the machine guns. They were coming to do what they had done at Isurava. He heard them move past his false front. He could smell them. A faint, oily scent of fish and tobacco. A voice whispered in Japanese. It was right outside. He saw a shadow move, then another. They were crouched, moving slowly, their eyes scanning the jungle. They were good. They were very good. One of them spotted Bluey's trench. The shadow raised its hand. A grenade. Not yet, Jacko. Not yet. He forced himself to wait. The Japanese soldier tossed the grenade. It landed with a soft thud in Bluey's pit. There was a desperate cry. No! Followed by the crump of the explosion. Now, Jacko whispered. The other infiltrators, 4 of them, seeing their target confirmed, rushed forward toward the ruined pit, ready to finish the job. They ran right past Jacko's false front. They were 15 yards away, perfectly side-on, silhouetted against the slightly lighter mud of the track. Jacko pulled the trigger on the Bren. The sound in the confined space was deafening, a hammering roar that vibrated in his bones. He didn't spray. He fired in controlled 3-round bursts. Tap, 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 tap. The Japanese team didn't know what hit them. They weren't shot from the front where they expected. They were scythed down from the flank. The heavy 303 rounds tore through them. A sudden, shocking eruption of violence. They folded, one after another, like puppets with their strings cut. The entire engagement lasted 4 seconds. Silence slammed back in, broken only by the tink-tink-tink of hot shell casings landing in the mud at Jacko's feet and the high-pitched whine in his ears. From the platoon line 100 yards back, he heard Sergeant Miller yell, "Riley! Riley! Report! What's going on?" Jacko took a shaky breath. His hands were locked onto the Bren's grip. "Probe neutralized, Sarge," he yelled back, his voice hoarse. Four down. Bluey's gone." The rest of the night was silent. The Japanese, confused by the sudden, devastating fire from an unknown position, melted back into the jungle. They didn't test the line again. At dawn, Sergeant Miller came down. He looked at Bluey's ruined trench, his face grim. Then he walked over to where the Japanese patrol lay. He studied them, seeing the lateral entry wounds. He walked to Jacko's position. It was invisible until he was right on top of it. He squatted down, peering into the dark, root-covered hole. Jacko, his face covered in mud and cordite stains, just looked back. Miller nodded slowly. "Right." He stood up. "Private Riley, you'll stay here. The rest of the section is digging new pits, exactly like this one. Show 'em how, Jacko. Show 'em all." Chapter 8. The Real Trial. Combat Brigade Hill, The Track, September 8, 1942, 11. The situation was no longer a retreat. It was a full-blown crisis. The veteran 214th and 216th Battalions had been thrown into the fight, but the Japanese, reinforced and relentless, had outflanked them yet again. The entire Australian 21st Brigade was on the verge of being encircled and annihilated at a place called Brigade Hill. The order was given: withdrawal, leapfrog retreat. A Company holds while B Company falls back. Jacko's platoon, part of A Company, was given the worst job: rear guard. They were to hold a narrow, muddy track, the only escape route, for as long as possible. "This is it, boys," Sergeant Miller yelled over the din of battle. The air was thick with smoke and the scream of mortars. "We don't hold this track. The whole bloody brigade is finished. Dig in. Use the Riley pattern. 2-man teams. Go." Jacko and a new recruit, a kid named Thompson, dug their L pit on a sharp bend in the track. They worked with a desperate, frantic energy, their shovels a blur. They had 20 minutes. "Make it deep, Tomo," Jacko panted. "Deeper than you think." They finished their wombat hole, just as the first wave of retreating Australians, the wounded and the weary, streamed past them. "Good luck, mate," one wounded digger grunted, clutching a red-soaked bandage on his arm. "They're right behind us. Thousands of them." Then they were alone. The jungle fell quiet. Jacko and Thompson were in the firing bay, the Bren gun set up, magazines stacked. "I'm scared, Jacko," Thompson whispered, his face chalk white. Just do what I do. Jacko said, his own voice tight. "Don't fire till I say, and keep your head down." The wait was 5 minutes. It felt like 5 years. Then they heard it. Not the swish of infiltrators. This was a new sound, a crashing, trampling noise, and a chorus of voices shouting, "Banzai!" They came around the bend. It wasn't a probe, it was a company, at least 180 men, high on victory, charging down the track. They were a wave of khaki and steel, bayonets fixed, their officers waving swords. They saw the false front of the pit, the pile of logs, and let out a roar. This was it, the last Australian position. "Wait, wait," Jacko whispered, his thumb on the trigger. The Japanese charged. They were 30 yards away. 20. They were running past the firing bay, focusing on the decoy. "Now!" Jacko screamed. He and Thompson opened up. Jacko on the Bren, Thompson with his Enfield. They weren't firing at a mass. They were firing into it, from the side. Every .303 round found a target. The effect was catastrophic. The front rank of the Japanese charge simply dissolved. Men were spun around, knocked off their feet, tumbling into a mangled pile. The charge faltered, the men behind crashing into the wall of their own dead. They stopped, confused. Where was the gun? "Mortars!" a Japanese officer screamed. The whump, whump, whump of knee mortars started. Rounds rained down. They hit the false front, blowing the logs to splinters. They landed all around the hidden pit. A piece of shrapnel screeched off their log roof, but it held. "They're pulling back," Thompson yelled, elated. "Get ready," Jacko yelled, slamming a fresh magazine into the Bren. That was just the first go. Hour 2. The Japanese were smarter now. They stopped the frontal charges. They began to use fire and move tactics. Machine guns opened up from the trees, spraying the entire area. Bullets thwacked into the mudbank, inches above their heads. "They're trying to flank us, Jacko," Thompson yelled, firing his Enfield into the jungle at a muzzle flash. A bullet snapped past his head, and he ducked. "I can't see him." "Don't need to see him. Just fire at the green part." A grenade landed on the track. Jacko saw it. "Grenade!" He grabbed Thompson and pulled him down into the bottom of the pit, curling into a ball. The explosion was deafening. Mud and shrapnel rained down. When Jacko looked up, Thompson was groaning, his leg. It was a mess. "I'm hit, Jacko. I'm hit." "You're all right, mate." "You're all right," Jacko lied, grabbing a field dressing and tying it desperately around Thompson's thigh. "Just keep loading. Can you load magazines?" Thompson nodded, his face slick with sweat and tears. Hour 3. Jacko was alone. Thompson was unconscious, bleeding out in the corner of the pit. The Bren was almost too hot to touch. His shoulder was a raw, bruised piece of meat from the recoil. He was down to his last 2 magazines. The Japanese knew he was alone. They could hear the slowing rate of fire. The officer's sword flashed in the jungle gloom. "Totsugeki, charge!" This was it, the final charge. Not a wave, a flood. They poured down the track screaming, determined to overrun the pit by sheer weight of numbers. Jacko leaned on the trigger. He didn't fire bursts. He held it down. The Bren roared, a long, desperate, final scream of defiance. He emptied the magazine, scything down the first line. He slammed his last magazine in. It was 28 rounds. Click, click, click. The bolt locked back, empty. The jungle was silent, save for the sound of his own ragged breathing and the thud, thud, thud of running feet. A Japanese soldier, his face a mask of rage, appeared at the edge of the pit. He was 10 feet away. He raised his Arisaka rifle, the bayonet gleaming. Jacko didn't even have time to grab his pistol. He grabbed the only thing he had, his shovel. He roared, a sound of pure, primal fear and rage, and lunged up out of the pit. He swung the sharpened steel shovel like an axe. He met the soldier's bayonet charge with a downward stroke, severing the rifle stock and sinking the blade deep into the man's shoulder. Another soldier was right behind him. Jacko wrenched the shovel free and swung again, a horizontal cut that took the man across the face. He was on his feet, exposed, a wild man covered in mud and his enemy's vital fluids, screaming and swinging his shovel. He saw the officer, sword raised, running at him. "This is it. I'm done. Brrrr, ape, brrrr, AP." A new Bren gun, from his flank. The Japanese officer stopped, looked surprised, and then fell forward. The charging soldiers behind him were cut down. Sergeant Miller and 2 other men from the reserve platoon had crawled up through the jungle. They had seen Jacko's stand. They had seen the final charge. "Give 'em hell, boys," Miller roared, firing from the hip. The Japanese attack, already broken by Jacko's 3-hour defense and shocked by the newfound fire, shattered. They fled, melting back into the jungle, leaving the track choked with their dead. Jacko stood there, swaying, still holding the shovel. He looked at the carnage. The track was a ruin. He looked at Thompson, still and pale in the pit. Then he fell to his knees, the adrenaline gone, leaving only a vast, empty silence. He had held the track. The brigade was safe. Chapter 9. Domino Effect and Recognition. The Gap. Kokoda Track, September 15, 1942, 10. The survivors of the 21st Brigade, including Jacko, were withdrawn. They were walking skeletons, their uniforms in tatters, their bodies stick-thin and covered in jungle sores. But they had held. At a staging area known as the Gap, they met the fresh troops coming up the line, the 25th Brigade. These men were fit, clean, and carrying new equipment. They looked at the veterans of the 39th and 214th with a mixture of awe and horror. A major, the 25th Brigade's new CO, was debriefing the survivors. He was listening to Sergeant Miller. "And that's what saved us, sir," Miller said, his voice raspy. "Not the book, the pit, the Riley pattern, we call it." The major, a man who had seen the doctrine fail in Malaya, walked over to Jacko, who was sitting with his back to a tree, trying to eat a piece of bully beef. "Private Riley," Jacko, startled, scrambled to his feet. "Sir, show me this. Pattern. Draw it for me." Jacko, shaking from malaria, knelt in the mud and drew the L shape. He explained it in his simple, direct terms. "You make 'em think you're here, sir, but you're really here. You let 'em run past, you get 'em from the side, you funnel 'em." The major stared at the drawing for a full minute. He wasn't looking at a crude drawing in the mud. He was looking at a solution born of the terrain itself. "This is brilliant," he whispered. "This is jungle tactics." He stood up. "Sergeant Major, get every platoon sergeant here now. They're not moving one more step up this track until they know how to dig one of these. This Riley pattern is now standard defensive doctrine for this brigade. Understood?" "Sir," the RSM boomed. For the next 2 days, Jacko Riley, a painfully shy 19-year-old shearer, became the most important instructor in the Australian Army. He, along with Miller, supervised the digging of the new pits, showing the fresh troops how to camouflage the roof, how to cut the firing lanes, how to build the trap. The effect was immediate. As the 25th Brigade began its advance, the first advance of the campaign, they used the Riley pattern. The Japanese, expecting the same old boulder tactics, walked straight into the sheep race. Their infiltration and banzai tactics were met with devastating interlocking fields of enfilade fire from positions they couldn't even see. Casualties on the Australian side dropped dramatically. Japanese casualties soared. The tide was beginning to turn, one L-shaped pit at a time. A report, written by the major, made its way to Port Moresby. The Defensive Innovation by Private J. Riley, 39th BTN, has proven to be a decisive tactical development. It utilizes the enemy's own aggressive doctrine against him, turning his flanking maneuvers into a death trap. This adaptation to the terrain is, in my opinion, the key to defensive victory in this theater. The unlikely mind had just rewritten the book. Chapter 10. Field Modifications and Enemy Countermeasures. War is a conversation. Each side learns, adapts, and responds. As the Riley pattern spread, it evolved. The troops, in their typical digger fashion, started tinkering. "The Riley L is good," one corporal from the 216th said, "but what if they come from the other side?" Thus, the Riley Cross was born. They added another, shorter trench on the other side, forming a T or a P+. A two-man team could now cover both flanks and the front. "What about a mortar?" another digger asked. "That roof's good, but a direct hit." They started digging deeper, adding grenade sumps to every pit. They used steel pickets scavenged from destroyed Japanese positions to reinforce their roofs. The Riley honeycomb was the next step. Instead of isolated pits, platoons began digging a series of interconnected L-pits. A soldier could fire from one, and if it was spotted, he could crawl through a narrow tunnel to a secondary pit 10 yards away. The entire Australian line became a subterranean camouflaged fortress. It was a fluid, deadly defense. The Japanese, for their part, were not stupid. They were shocked. Their tactics, which had shattered the British in Malaya and the Americans in the Philippines, were failing. They were charging into empty air and being slaughtered from invisible holes. They adapted. They stopped their headlong banzai charges. They began to use their knee mortars with even greater precision. They would walk the mortars across a suspected position, trying to find the lump of the hidden pit. They learned to look for the tiny, dark holes of the firing ports. Their snipers became more active, climbing high into the canopy to try and get a plunging angle into the pits. The fight became a deadly game of hide-and-seek. The most terrifying countermeasure was the infiltration probe. A single Japanese soldier, an expert, would crawl forward, not to attack, but just to find. He would lie in the mud for hours, waiting for a single sign: the glint of a wet helmet, the puff of smoke from a rifle, the sound of a cough. Then he would crawl back, and the mortars would do the rest. But the innovation had done its job. It had broken the enemy's momentum. It had given the Australians a newfound confidence. They were no longer the hunted. They were the trappers. Chapter 11. Unintended Costs and Moral Consequences. Sanananda, Papua New Guinea, December 18, 1942. Success came with a price. Jack O'Reilly was no longer Private Riley. He was Corporal Riley, the hero of Brigade Hill, the Wombat King. He had been pulled from the front line. He was too valuable. He was now at a training depot near Port Moresby teaching new reinforcements how to dig. He hated it. Every time he showed a group of fresh-faced kids how to build the killing bay, he felt a cold knot in his stomach. He wasn't teaching them how to fight. He was teaching them how to ambush. He was teaching them how to wait in a dark, cramped hole and then annihilate men who couldn't even see them. It was effective. It was necessary. And it felt wrong. "You gotta wait till they're close," he'd hear himself say, his voice flat and dead. 15, 20 yards. You wait till you can smell 'em. Then you give it to 'em. Don't stop till the first mag's empty. The kids would look at him with wide, respectful eyes. They saw a hero. He saw the faces of the men he'd cut down. He saw Thompson, bleeding out in the mud. The Riley pattern also had a tactical cost. It was a defensive innovation. It was so effective that it bred a new kind of trench shock. Men became reluctant to leave their pits. The wombat hole was safe. The jungle outside was death. Officers found it harder to get patrols to move. Unit cohesion suffered. The pit was a one-man world. It isolated the soldier. It was a paradox. The innovation that saved the individual soldier made it harder to fight as a unit. Sergeant Miller, now promoted to lieutenant, visited Jacko at the depot. He'd been wounded in the leg. "You're a hero, Jacko," Miller said, lighting a cigarette for him. "I'm a digger, sir. Nothing more." "You're a hero," Miller insisted, "and you hate it." "I can see it." Jacko looked at his hands. They were clean for the first time in months, but they still felt stained. "That day, at the hill, I used the shovel, sir." Miller's face darkened. He knew. You did what you had to, Jacko. You saved the brigade. But I liked it, Jacko whispered, the admission tearing out of him. For a second, when they were charging, I wasn't scared. I was angry, and I liked it. Miller put a hand on his shoulder. That doesn't make you a monster, son. That makes you a survivor. That's the part they don't put in the reports. The unintended cost. You've saved thousands of lives with that brain of yours, but you've lost your own peace of mind. That's the trade. Now get up. You've got more kids to teach. Chapter 12. Campaign End and Immediate Legacy. Gona, Papua New Guinea, January 2, 1943. The Kokoda Track campaign was over. The Japanese were shattered, their ambitious plan to take Port Moresby a ruin. The tattered, starving remnants of the South Seas Detachment were pushed back to their beachheads at Gona, Buna, and Sanananda, where they were systematically annihilated. The Riley pattern was a critical part of that victory. It had been the turning point, the moment the Australian Chocos and AIF diggers had stopped fighting a European war in a jungle and started fighting a jungle war. The innovation was formalized. It was drawn up by engineers, printed in training manuals, and disseminated to every Allied unit in the Southwest Pacific. The Americans, just beginning their own bloody slog through the islands, adopted it, calling it the Jungle L, or the Aussie Foxhole. Corporal Jack Riley's simple L-shaped trap, born of a shearer's practicality and a soldier's desperation, became the blueprint for defensive warfare for the rest of the Pacific War. On a humid parade ground in Port Moresby, Jacko stood in a clean, pressed uniform. His name was called for conspicuous gallantry and initiative at Brigade Hill, in devising and implementing a novel defensive position under extreme enemy pressure, and for holding a vital position for 3 hours against overwhelming forces, thereby saving his battalion from encirclement. The general pinned the ribbon of the military medal, MM, on his chest. It was a high honor for an enlisted man. Sergeant Miller, leaning on his cane, was in the front row. He gave Jacko a slow, proud wink. The strategic impact was undeniable. The unlikely mind had stalled an entire army, bought the time for reinforcements, and created the doctrine that would help win the war. Jacko Riley was a national hero. Chapter 13. Emotional and Historical Epilogue. Shepparton, Victoria, Australia, 1985. The man who walked his dog along the Goulburn River every morning was quiet, lean, and had a slight limp. No one in town knew his story. He was just Mr. Riley, the retired surveyor. He'd spent his life after the war mapping the flat, open farmlands of his home. He rarely spoke. He never went to Anzac Day marches. He had never, not once, picked up a shovel again if he could help it. A young historian from the Australian War Memorial found him. He sat with Jacko on his veranda, a tape recorder between them. "Mr. Riley," the historian said, "they're calling your L Pit the most significant tactical innovation of the New Guinea campaign. Some say it was as important as radar." Jacko sipped his tea. He looked out over the flat, dry grass of his yard. It was so different from the green hell. "It was just a hole," he said, his voice a soft rasp. "Just a better hole. The reports say you held off an entire company, over 180 men, for 3 hours, alone." Jacko was silent for a long time. He watched a kookaburra land on a fence post. "Not alone," he said. "I had young Tomo with me, till he was hit. And I had the ghosts of all the other blokes, Evans and Harris and Bluey, all the poor bastards who died in the regulation trenches." He turned to the young man, his eyes clear and sad. "You call it an innovation. I call it desperation. We were farmers. We were trappers. The Japs. They were good soldiers. Better than us at the start. They fought like warriors. So we had to stop fighting like soldiers. We had to start fighting like foxes. We had to go to ground." He looked down at his hands, the knuckles gnarled with age. They say I held 'em off, but it was the jungle that held them. The mud, the rot, the fear. I just gave the mud some teeth." The historian packed up, his tapes full. As he left, he asked one last question. "They were shocked, weren't they? The Japanese. The reports say they were completely shocked by your tactic." Jack O'Reilly stood in the doorway of his simple home, a figure silhouetted by the warm afternoon light. "I suppose they were," he said. "But you know, after all these years, I think I was too." He closed the door, and the only sound was the distant call of the kookaburra, laughing across the wide, open paddock.